The morning of June 14th, 1987, arrived with the kind of humidity that made shirts stick to skin before breakfast. In the small industrial town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the air smelled faintly of river water and the sweet decay of early summer grass. 7-year-old Daniel Carver had begged his mother all week to wear his new red high-top sneakers to the last day of school, bright, immaculate shoes with white laces he'd spent an entire evening learning to tie properly. His mother, Grace, had relented that morning, watching him bounce down the front steps of their narrow row house, those vivid red sneakers flashing in the sunlight like small beacons. She'd called after him to wait for his older sister, but he was already halfway down Maple Street, backpack bouncing, eager to show his second-grade teacher the shoes before summer swallowed the school year whole. By 3:30 that afternoon, those red sneakers would become the center of every conversation, every search grid, every prayer vigil for the next 2 decades. Daniel never arrived at Millbrook Elementary. His sister, waiting by the flagpole as instructed, searched the dismissal crowd twice before panic set in. The walk from their house to the school covered exactly 4 blocks, a route Daniel had walked dozens of times with supervision, fewer times alone. Grace Carver received the call from the principal's office at 3:47 p.m. By 4 o'clock, she was running those same 4 blocks, checking every porch, every alley, every parked car, shouting his name until her voice cracked. By 4:30, police had been notified. By dusk, the entire neighborhood had mobilized. If you're watching this story unfold and wondering how a routine morning can shatter so completely, consider subscribing. We dive deep into cases where ordinary days reveal extraordinary mysteries. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. These stories connect us across distances, and your perspective matters. The search began immediately. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where front doors stayed unlocked and children played street hockey until the lamps came on. The idea that a child could vanish in broad daylight on a well-traveled route defied the town's understanding of itself. Within hours, neighbors had formed search parties. The local volunteer fire department brought floodlights. Police canvassed every home along Maple Street, documenting who had been present, who had seen anything unusual, who owned vehicles matching vague descriptions of cars that might have slowed near a child that morning. One neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Foster, reported seeing a boy in red sneakers near the corner of Maple and 3rd around 8:20 a.m., roughly the time Daniel would have been walking. But she'd been watering her tomato plants, glancing up only briefly, and couldn't say for certain whether the child had turned toward the school or continued straight. Another witness, a postal worker named Raymond Blake, mentioned a dark blue sedan idling near the grocery store 2 blocks from the school, but he hadn't noted the license plate and couldn't describe the driver beyond maybe a man, maybe middle-aged. These fragments, a glimpse of red, a dark car, the everyday traffic of a Thursday morning, became the foundation of an investigation that would stretch across 3 decades. Police brought in tracking dogs the following day. The animals picked up Daniel's scent from a baseball cap he'd left in his bedroom and followed it down Maple Street. At the intersection of 3rd, the trail fractured. One dog indicated interest near a storm drain. Another pulled toward an empty lot where construction equipment sat idle. The scent dissipated there, lost among exhaust fumes and disturbed earth. Investigators cordoned off the area, sifting through gravel and mud, finding nothing but cigarette butts and rusted nails. It was as if Daniel had simply ceased to exist at that corner. The Carver family became a study in suspended animation. Grace quit her job at the textile factory to coordinate searches and field tips. Daniel's father, Joseph, a machinist at the rail yard, took every overtime shift available, funneling money into private investigators and reward funds, while avoiding the empty chair at their dinner table. Daniel's sister Rebecca, then 11 years old, stopped sleeping through the night. She'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, convinced she'd heard her brother's voice calling from the backyard. The family kept Daniel's room exactly as he'd left it. Homework papers on the desk, action figures arranged on the shelf, those red sneakers missing, but their absence marked by the space they should have occupied. Flyers papered every lamppost within 50 miles. Daniel's school photo, a gap-toothed grin, cowlick refusing to stay flat, appeared in newspapers across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added his case to their database. Tips flooded in during the first months. Sightings at rest stops, claims from psychics, accusations against local residents with no basis in evidence. Each lead required investigation. Police followed up on reports of a boy matching Daniel's description seen at a truck stop in Ohio, only to find the child belonged to a family passing through. A woman in West Virginia called to report a boy living with a reclusive couple. But when authorities arrived, the child was the couple's grandson, visiting for the summer. One lead seemed particularly promising. 3 weeks after Daniel's disappearance, a clerk at a convenience store in Erie reported a boy who matched the description trying to use a phone without money. By the time police arrived, the boy was gone. Security footage from the store was grainy, inconclusive. Investigators spent weeks in Erie, interviewing employees, checking bus schedules, reviewing motel registries. They found nothing concrete. The boy in the footage could have been Daniel, or one of 1,000 other children passing through a border town in the summer of 1987. The lead evaporated, leaving behind only the familiar ache of near certainty, followed by absence. Years accumulated like sediment. The Carver family marked Daniel's birthdays with cakes no one ate, candles that burned down to wax puddles. Grace joined support groups for families of missing children, learning the vocabulary of ambiguous loss, the grief that comes without closure, without burial, without the permission to move forward, or the ability to stay still. Joseph stopped talking about his son in the past tense, a small rebellion against the statistics that said most missing children are found in the first 72 hours, or not at all. Rebecca grew up carrying the weight of being the sibling who came home, who survived, who couldn't save her brother. The investigation shifted over time from urgent to cold, from daily updates to annual reviews. Detectives retired, case files were transferred to new hands. But Grace refused to let Daniel become a forgotten name in a manila folder. She maintained contact with the Pennsylvania State Police, calling every few months to ask if new technologies might offer fresh leads. In the late 1990s, when DNA databases became more sophisticated, she submitted her own genetic material, hoping it might someday match against unidentified remains or children found in circumstances that had stripped them of their names. Nothing matched. Daniel existed in a bureaucratic limbo, neither confirmed dead nor proven alive, a case kept open by regulation and a mother's refusal to accept silence as an answer. Law enforcement did what they could within the constraints of technology and resources. In those early years, information sharing between jurisdictions was laborious, dependent on phone calls and faxed documents. Databases were regional, not national. A child who crossed state lines could effectively disappear into a patchwork of disconnected systems. Investigators checked juvenile detention records, foster care placements, hospital admissions. They interviewed registered offenders, reviewed parking tickets issued near the school on the morning of June 14th, cross-referenced vehicle registrations against employment records of anyone with access to children. The work was meticulous and ultimately inconclusive. As the years stretched into decades, the town of Millbrook changed. The textile mills closed. Young families moved away for work. The elementary school Daniel never reached underwent renovations, then consolidation, then eventual closure. Maple Street's row houses were sold, repainted, occupied by people who'd never heard of the Carver boy. But Grace remained, unwilling to leave the address Daniel knew. the place he might someday try to find. She kept the porch light on every night, a small act of faith in the face of compounding improbability. In 2015, 28 years after Daniel disappeared, Grace received a phone call that made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped the receiver. A man had walked into a police station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, about 90 miles from Millbrook, claiming to be Daniel Carver. He was 35 years old, lean and weathered, with a hesitant way of speaking that suggested long periods of isolation. He'd provided identifying details: the row house on Maple Street, his sister's name, the red sneakers he'd been wearing. He remembered his mother's voice, the smell of her coffee, the way his father hummed tunelessly while reading the newspaper. He said he'd been taken, held, and had finally escaped. He said he wanted to come home. The Harrisburg detective handling the case, a methodical woman named Lieutenant Pamela Ortiz, had seen enough false claims to approach the situation with cautious professionalism. People emerged periodically, claiming to be long-missing persons, motivated by mental illness, attention-seeking, or genuine confusion about their own identities. Protocol required verification. Ortiz arranged for a controlled meeting with Grace and Joseph Carver, conducted in a neutral location with trauma counselors present. She also initiated background checks, requested documentation, and prepared to collect DNA samples for comparison. The meeting took place on a cool October afternoon in a conference room that smelled of industrial carpet and instant coffee. Grace entered first, her hands clutched around a worn photograph of 7-year-old Daniel. The man who claimed to be her son stood when she entered, a reflexive politeness that she recognized somehow as familiar. He was tall, taller than anyone in their family, with a face that might have once resembled the child in the photo, but had been reshaped by decades of unknown experience. His eyes were the right color, hazel flecked with gold, but the expression in them was unreadable, cautious, defended. He spoke first. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the word. "I'm sorry it took so long." Grace moved toward him as if pulled by an invisible thread. Joseph remained near the door, rigid with a hope too painful to fully embrace. The man calling himself Daniel recounted fragments of his childhood with startling accuracy: the layout of their old kitchen, the neighbor's dog who'd once bitten through their fence, the blue ceramic owl that had sat on Grace's dresser. He described being taken by a man he couldn't clearly remember, held in places that shifted over the years, controlled through fear and isolation. He said he'd been moved frequently, kept away from schools and public spaces, given a different name. He said he'd escaped 6 months earlier and had spent that time working up the courage to come forward, terrified he wouldn't be believed or wanted. Grace wanted to believe with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. Joseph's skepticism was protective, a father's instinct against another disappointment. Rebecca, now 39 and living in Ohio with her own family, was contacted immediately. She flew in the following day, bringing with her a box of Daniel's childhood belongings, drawings, a stuffed animal, a birthday card he'd made her the month before he disappeared. The man examined these objects with what appeared to be genuine emotion, but emotion alone wasn't proof. Lieutenant Ortiz moved forward with verification. DNA samples were collected and sent to the state lab for comparison against Grace's existing genetic profile. The process would take weeks. Meanwhile, Ortiz began compiling the man's recent history. He'd been living under the name David Brennan for the past 3 years, working construction jobs for cash, renting a room in a boarding house on the outskirts of Harrisburg. Before that, his past grew murky. A series of transient addresses, gaps in employment, no clear paper trail extending back more than a decade. He had no social security number, no driver's license, no medical records. For someone claiming to have been held against his will for nearly 3 decades, the lack of documentation made sense. For someone building a false identity, it was equally plausible. While awaiting DNA results, a social worker named Judith Ramirez was assigned to conduct psychological evaluations. The man spoke haltingly about his captivity, describing basements and locked rooms, a captor who died several years prior, supposedly freeing him, but leaving him without knowledge of how to navigate the outside world. He mentioned dissociative episodes, periods where time felt fluid and memory unreliable. Ramirez noted that his trauma presentation was consistent with long-term captivity, but trauma could also be fabricated or misattributed. The human mind was capable of convincing itself of histories that never occurred, particularly in individuals with certain psychological vulnerabilities. Grace brought the man. She still thought of him as the man, unable to fully commit to Daniel until proof arrived, to the old row house. She'd kept it largely unchanged, a museum of arrested time. He walked through rooms with an expression that might have been recognition or might have been careful performance. In Daniel's bedroom, he paused at the shelf where action figures still stood guard. He picked up a small plastic superhero missing one arm and turned it over in his hands. Grace watched for some definitive gesture, some irrefutable sign that this was her son. What she saw was a man holding a toy, with the reverence of someone encountering a holy relic. But whether it was his holy relic remained uncertain. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November. Lieutenant Ortiz called Grace directly, her voice carefully neutral. The results were negative. The man claiming to be Daniel Carver was not genetically related to Grace or Joseph. He was not their son. The news arrived like a second disappearance, a second theft. Grace sat at her kitchen table, the phone still pressed to her ear, unable to process the information. Joseph stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his face showing a complicated mixture of vindication and grief. Right to have been skeptical, devastated to have been right. The man who'd spent weeks believing himself reunited with family was confronted with a truth that unraveled his entire recent reality. He wasn't Daniel Carver. He never had been. But if he wasn't Daniel, then who was he? And why did he believe with apparent sincerity that he was? Lieutenant Ortiz expanded her investigation. If the man wasn't Daniel, discovering his actual identity became crucial, both for his sake and to determine whether criminal fraud charges were warranted. His fingerprints, previously run against databases without matches, were submitted again with different search parameters. This time they connected to a missing persons report filed in 1989 in upstate New York. The man was identified as Brian Holloway, who disappeared at age 11 from a foster care placement in Albany. Brian's story emerged in pieces, assembled from social service records, court documents, and the fragmented testimony he was able to provide once confronted with his true identity. He'd been removed from his biological parents due to severe neglect and abuse at age 6. He'd cycled through multiple foster homes, each placement more unstable than the last. At 11, he'd run away from a group home, eventually falling into the control of a man named Leonard Voss, who had a documented history of exploiting vulnerable children. Voss had moved frequently, keeping Brian isolated, using a combination of physical control and psychological manipulation to prevent escape. Brian's memories of his early childhood were fragmented, traumatized, and unreliable. At some point, the exact timeline remained unclear. Brian's understanding of his own identity had fractured. Whether through deliberate manipulation by his captor, trauma-induced dissociation, or a desperate psychological need to construct a more bearable past, he'd absorbed details about missing children he'd encountered in news reports or overheard in conversations. Daniel Carver's case, with its well-documented details and persistent media presence over the years, had somehow lodged in Brian's consciousness. When he'd finally escaped Voss's control after the man's death in 2013, Brian had wandered for months in a dissociative state, trying to piece together who he was. The Carver story had felt true to him, not in a calculated, deceptive way, but as a genuine false memory his traumatized mind had constructed to fill the void where his real childhood should have been. This revelation was documented by forensic psychologist Dr. Nathan Cross, who evaluated Brian extensively. Dr. Cross explained that prolonged trauma, particularly during developmental years, could result in identity confusion and the incorporation of external narratives into personal memory. Brian hadn't been attempting to deceive the Carvers. He genuinely believed he was Daniel, believed it with the conviction that comes from a mind trying desperately to make sense of its own history. The red sneakers, the row house layout, the family details, these had been absorbed from news accounts he'd read or heard during his captivity, when Voss had occasionally allowed access to newspapers or television. His brain had woven these fragments into a coherent but false autobiography. The Carver family was left to process this information. Grace's initial anger at the deception dissolved when she understood that Brian had been a victim, not a con artist. Joseph struggled with the cruelty of circumstance, to have hope rekindled and extinguished, to discover their son hadn't returned, but also to meet someone who'd suffered losses perhaps even greater than their own. Rebecca found herself grieving for Brian, for her still missing brother, for her parents who'd endured this emotional whiplash. But the story took another turn. Lieutenant Ortiz, troubled by Brian's case and the failure of previous searches to locate him, decided to revisit Daniel Carver's files with fresh perspective. She requested that the Pennsylvania State Police conduct a comprehensive review of school records from Millbrook Elementary, specifically focusing on the year 1987. Modern digitization efforts had made old paper records more accessible. What she found in those archives would fundamentally challenge everything the Carver family believed about their son's disappearance. The enrollment records for Millbrook Elementary's second-grade class in the 1986-1987 academic year listed 23 students. Daniel Carver's name appeared on the roster for September through early December. But starting in January 1987, a notation appeared beside his name: transferred to Riverside Academy. Riverside was a small private school in the neighboring county, serving students with learning differences and behavioral challenges. The notation included a transfer date, January 12, 1987, 5 months before the supposed disappearance. Ortiz pulled records from Riverside Academy. They showed Daniel Carver enrolled from January through May of 1987. Attending regularly, receiving grades, participating in activities. A photograph from the school's spring festival in April showed a boy matching Daniel's description, wearing overalls and holding a blue ribbon from a science fair. The records indicated he'd completed the school year and was scheduled to return for third grade in September. But in August 1987, a withdrawal form had been filed, signed by Grace Carver, stating the family was relocating out of state. Grace, confronted with these documents, insisted she'd never withdrawn Daniel from Millbrook Elementary, never enrolled him at Riverside, never filed transfer paperwork. But the signatures on the forms, while not identical to her handwriting, were close enough to pass administrative scrutiny. Someone had falsified documents, created a paper trail showing Daniel completing the school year elsewhere, then withdrawing before fall enrollment. The June 14th disappearance, the red sneakers, the walk to school that ended in absence, had never happened. Further investigation revealed that in late 1986, Grace and Joseph had briefly separated due to marital strain. During this period, Joseph had moved temporarily to Harrisburg for work, taking Daniel with him and enrolling him at Riverside Academy because the school offered programs for Daniel's mild attention difficulties. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, lasting only 1 semester before the family reunited. Grace, dealing with her own struggles during the separation, had minimal contact with Daniel during those months. Phone calls supervised by Joseph, infrequent visits. She'd been told Daniel was thriving at the new school, and in her own emotional turmoil, she hadn't questioned the arrangement deeply. In May 1987, Joseph had called Grace to say he was bringing Daniel home for the summer, that they would work on reconciliation. But Daniel never arrived. Joseph, it turned out, had fabricated the withdrawal paperwork and taken Daniel. Not in a sudden abduction, but in a premeditated decision to sever the child from his mother's life. He'd moved with Daniel to a distant state, changing their names, building a new existence. The June 14th disappearance had been staged, a story Joseph had carefully constructed, knowing Grace would report Daniel missing from Millbrook, that searches would focus on the route to a school Daniel hadn't attended in months. The revelation shattered Grace's understanding of her own past. The man she'd grieved alongside, who'd worked overtime to fund searches, who'd sat at that empty dinner table, he'd been Daniel's abductor. Joseph Carver had died in 2003, taking his secrets with him. Whatever motivated him, rage at Grace, delusion about protecting Daniel, sheer controlling cruelty, would never be fully known. Grace was left to reframe 28 years of memory through this new, horrific lens. But the most pressing question remained. Where was Daniel now? Investigators tracked Joseph's movements after 1987. He'd relocated to rural Montana under the name Joseph Brennan, working in logging and construction, keeping Daniel isolated from anyone who might recognize them. School records from Montana showed a child named Michael Brennan enrolled in local schools from 1987 through 1995, the name Joseph had given Daniel. Teachers described Michael as quiet, reserved, with an older father who was protective to the point of controlling. Daniel had grown up believing his mother had abandoned him, that she'd never wanted him, that his father had rescued him from an abusive home. Joseph had fed him a counter-narrative as compelling and false as Brian Holloway's mistaken identity. In 1995, at age 15, Michael Brennan, Daniel Carver, had run away from his father's home in Montana. He'd left no note, taken nothing but a backpack and some cash. He'd effectively disappeared a second time, but this disappearance was voluntary, an adolescent's desperate bid for freedom from a father whose control had become suffocating. From there, his trail was sporadic. A juvenile detention stint in Idaho for shoplifting, a stint at a group home in Washington, then nothing. He'd aged out of systems meant to track vulnerable youth, becoming one of thousands of young adults navigating life without stable identity documents or family connections. Investigators eventually located a man named Michael Brennan, working at a warehouse in Portland, Oregon. He was 35 years old, living alone, with minimal social connections. When approached by law enforcement with questions about his childhood in Montana, he'd been guarded, confused. DNA testing confirmed what the paper trail suggested. Michael Brennan was Daniel Carver. The reunion that followed was nothing like Grace had imagined during 28 years of waiting. Daniel, he still thought of himself as Michael, the name he'd known since age 7, was brought to Pennsylvania under circumstances that felt more like interrogation than homecoming. He had no memory of Grace, no recollection of the row house on Maple Street, no attachment to the red sneakers that had become symbols of loss. His entire childhood was the Montana home, the isolated logging towns, the father who'd raised him with rigid rules and buried secrets. Learning that his life had been built on kidnapping and lies was its own form of trauma. Grace met her son in the same conference room where she'd met Brian Holloway months earlier. The resemblance to the child in the photograph was undeniable once you knew to look for it. The hazel eyes, the shape of his jaw, the way he tilted his head when listening. But the man before her was a stranger. He wasn't hostile, just profoundly disconnected. She was to him a woman claiming maternal rights to someone he didn't recognize as himself. The legal and psychological aftermath was complex. Daniel was an adult, capable of making his own decisions about relationships and identity. Grace couldn't reclaim lost years through force of will. What followed was a slow, painful process of introducing two people who should have known each other intimately, but instead had to start from absolute zero. Family therapist, Dr. Lyndon Guyen specialized in reunification cases involving long-term parental abduction. She worked with Grace and Daniel in sessions that focused on building trust without demanding instant connection, acknowledging the validity of Daniel's Montana childhood while helping him integrate the truth about his origins. Daniel struggled with anger at Joseph, a man he'd loved despite everything, whose death 12 years earlier had left him grieving, and who was now revealed as an architect of sustained cruelty. He struggled equally with ambivalence toward Grace, whom he intellectually understood as victim but emotionally experienced as an intrusive stranger. Rebecca reached out to her brother cautiously, offering connection without pressure, sharing stories about the sibling relationship they'd once had. Daniel listened, absorbing information about a life he couldn't remember, trying to reconcile the Carver family's pain with his own need to preserve some coherent sense of self. The case raised uncomfortable questions about missing persons investigations. How had Joseph's document forgery gone undetected? Why hadn't school records been cross-referenced earlier? The answer lay partly in the limitations of 1980s technology and partly in assumptions built into search protocols. When a child disappears, investigators focus on stranger abduction, accident, or foul play. They canvass the immediate area, interview potential witnesses, check databases of recovered remains. They don't typically audit school enrollment records for discrepancies that might suggest family court violations or custodial interference. Daniel's case had fallen into the gap between missing persons investigations and family law enforcement, a gap that in 1987 was wider and less monitored than it would be in subsequent decades. Brian Holloway's mistaken identity had been the catalyst for uncovering the truth. His arrival, his false claim, his DNA test, and the subsequent careful review of records had revealed inconsistencies that might otherwise have remained buried in paper archives. Brian himself was receiving intensive therapy, working to reconstruct his actual identity and process the traumas inflicted by Leonard Voss. The state of New York had reopened his missing persons case and was providing resources for his rehabilitation and integration. In a strange way, two missing children had been found, one who believed himself to be the other, leading to the discovery that the first had never been missing in the way anyone thought. Grace continued living in the Millbrook row house, though she'd finally allowed herself to box up Daniel's childhood room. The red sneakers, found eventually in Joseph's Montana storage unit, packed away with other remnants of Daniel's early life, were returned to her. She kept them on a shelf in her bedroom, not as a shrine but as a tangible reminder of the day everything changed. Daniel visited occasionally, hesitant trips that felt more like diplomacy than homecoming. They talked about neutral subjects, building vocabulary for a relationship that might someday become familial but currently existed in uncertain space. Rebecca maintained the most consistent contact with Daniel, serving as bridge between him and Grace. She understood, having spent her own childhood shadowed by his absence, that relationships fractured by trauma couldn't be repaired on any predetermined timeline. She'd started a small non-profit focused on advocating for better interagency communication in missing children cases, pushing for protocols that would flag inconsistencies in school records and prevent other families from losing decades to preventable errors. The Millbrook community struggled to process the revelation that Daniel had never been abducted by a stranger. that the search efforts and vigils had been responses to a crime much closer and more personal than anyone imagined. Some felt betrayed by Joseph's deception. Others felt profound sorrow for the years Grace had spent searching for a child hidden in plain bureaucratic sight. The case became a case study in law enforcement training programs, illustrating the importance of questioning assumptions and maintaining curiosity even in cases that seemed straightforward. Daniel himself remained in Portland, continuing his quiet life while working with therapists to integrate the truth about his origins. He didn't hate Grace. Hate required a level of connection he didn't feel. He was learning to hold multiple truths simultaneously: that Joseph had kidnapped and lied to him, but had also been the only parent he'd known for most of his life. That Grace had suffered immeasurably, but that her suffering didn't automatically create obligation on his part to fulfill her hopes for reunion. That he was both Michael Brennan and Daniel Carver, and that neither name fully captured who he'd become. The story of Daniel Carver, told and retold in true crime documentaries and investigative journalism pieces, became more than a cautionary tale about missing children. It became a meditation on identity itself, on how we construct ourselves from memory and narrative, on what happens when those narratives are revealed as fiction, on the possibility of building something real from fragments and ruins. Grace's decades of searching had ended not with the joyful reunion of movies and television, but with a more ambiguous resolution. Her son was alive, and they were strangers learning to speak the same language. Years after the truth emerged, Grace received a letter from Daniel. It was brief, formal, but genuine. He thanked her for respecting his need for space. He acknowledged that none of the past had been her fault. He said he was working on forgiveness of Joseph, of the systems that had failed them both, of the universe that had conspired to steal their relationship. He said he wasn't ready for closeness, but could imagine someday a version of family that didn't require erasing the years they'd spent apart. Grace kept the letter in the same box as the red sneakers, two artifacts of a life interrupted and imperfectly resumed. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children updated their protocols based on lessons from Daniel's case, emphasizing the importance of verifying school attendance and checking for custodial interference in early stages of investigations. Training materials now include sections on document forgery indicators and the need to question even seemingly cooperative family members. The case contributed to broader conversations about parental abduction as a form of child abuse, about the lifelong impacts of identity theft, about the need for trauma-informed reunification practices that prioritize the survivor's autonomy over the family's desire for closure. If you're watching this story and wondering about the families in your own community who've experienced similar losses, consider reaching out to organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children or the National Center for Missing Adults. These groups provide resources, advocacy, and support for families navigating the impossible terrain of ambiguous loss. They also need volunteers, donations, and voices willing to keep these stories in public consciousness. Every case that goes cold is someone's Daniel, someone's Grace, someone's waiting. The red sneakers remain on Grace's shelf, still bright despite decades in darkness. They're a reminder that objects outlast memory, that physical things anchor us to truth even when narratives fail. They're a reminder that some disappearances aren't what they seem, that the most dangerous deceptions often come from those we trust most completely. And they're a reminder that coming home isn't always a moment of arrival. Sometimes it's a process, a negotiation, a choice made again and again to bridge impossible distances. Daniel Carver came back, but not in the way anyone imagined. The family reunion happened, but it looked nothing like the fantasies that had sustained Grace through 28 years of searching. The truth emerged, but it brought no simple resolution. What remained was the harder, more honest work of building something new from pieces that didn't fit together easily, of accepting that some losses can't be fully recovered, and of finding meaning not in the reunion itself, but in the choice to keep trying, keep speaking, keep reaching across the years toward understanding.